Okay, so it's we're on episode 7 now on the podcast, and we're happy to say this is the first episode we've got a actual guest on board. So we have Rich O'Hagan on from, well, a fellow Irishman as well, which is a good start for the guest list. So we'll let Rich introduce himself in a few moments, but we'll go into a lot of different things tonight, and Rich will kind of go into how he got into Bitcoin and the journey he's been on. We've all had our own journeys, obviously, and everybody's is very different, but quite similar in many ways as well. And this is the first time, obviously, Chris is here as well. I'll let Chris probably lead the conversation because you've met before. Obviously, you guys have met a few years ago, haven't you?
Yeah, we met at the Bitcoin Ireland conference a couple of years back. Followed Rich then after that from on social media, and yeah, find it interesting. Find his views very interesting, very close to home. Very aligned in how I think as well. He's also written quite a lot of articles, which I've been impressed with. I think he articulates himself very well. We'll share links to that as well at the end. But yeah, we've met a couple of years ago. I think he's got a very interesting backstory as well, which he'll share in a second. But yeah, welcome, Rich. Hope everything is well, and I hope you're doing good.
Thank you very much. Thank you, guys. It's super to be here. I'm very honored to be the inaugural guest, and I hope I can articulate myself on a podcast. So thank you for a compliment about the articles, Chris. It's good
No
to be with you.
worries. Do you want to give the audience a bit of background on yourself? And yeah, your Bitcoin journey, how you got into it, and maybe what it means to you and where you think it's going in the future. So
Sure. I suppose like a lot of people in the Bitcoin space, as they say, I don't have a background in economics or finance, which seems to be an Achilles heel for many. I When I finished school, I actually joined the Irish Army. I was an officer in the Army for about 10 or 12 years. Um, so that's what I did with the first kind of part of my adult life. I served overseas on two kind of UN peacekeeping missions. So I was in the Lebanon in 2017, and I was in Syria, which is a pretty topical place at the moment, in 2020 for a year. Um, that actually dovetails with the start of my Bitcoin journey, so to speak. That's when I first encountered Bitcoin. I would just happened to, I suppose, stumble across some material from some of the talking heads in the space at the time. I think probably Michael Saylor, Robert Breedlove, a few of those guys. Um, I always find it interesting that I was in a country undergoing obviously a lot of problems when I came across Bitcoin. And I often wonder, in hindsight, we love to tell ourselves stories about why certain things clicked. So, I mean, there's no way to know if this is true or not, but I do think it's interesting that I was in a country where the currency was collapsing. Obviously, the social contract was, in a difficult place. It's obviously a complex country. I won't go into that too much, but there, I was in a country where when I crossed borders, you could see a lot of people exchanging money on the black market. You had a number of different currencies in circulation. So I do think that probably um, ushered or urged me to try and understand what was going on a little bit more. So when I did start looking into Bitcoin, I think perhaps I was able to view it somewhat outside the comfortable Western lens, or the kind of financial privilege that we often have in the West. So I think that probably helped to an extent. In any event, once I guess looked into it and read a few of the books and a lot of the articles and started listening to podcasts, the rest is history, as I say. I've pretty much been down the rabbit hole since, and discovering that it's one that only gets deeper. That it's not like you can just kind of come to a holistic view and know everything about Bitcoin. It touches so many areas of the world, beyond finance, beyond money. That it's like an endlessly fascinating journey, I guess. And I don't like to sound too dramatic by saying, we love using these terms like journey and your experience, but it really is quite an interesting, profound time in your life, because you do start to view the world completely differently. Everything starts to take on a different lease of life. You see things from a different angle, and it's very hard to go back. And that's one thing that I suppose I didn't intend to get into this now, but it can be a blessing and a curse. Often people speak about it in positive terms, but it is very difficult sometimes to be the person in the room who feels an overwhelming need to explain to other people why this form of magical internet money is so important and how it fixes so much. You are going to, if you take on that role, you're going to sound like a lunatic to most of your friends and family. You're going to be relatively annoying at times, and that's kind of difficult to avoid. But also the way that a lot of the world works, I don't know exactly what it is about Bitcoin, but it gives you a different appreciation of the way certain things work and don't work. So it makes certain things about the way the world operates somewhat hard to bear and hard to accept. And maybe we'll get into some of those later. So I genuinely mean that it's a blessing and a curse. I do think we're quite lucky in some regards. People often love talking about how open-minded and wonderfully intelligent you have to be to get Bitcoin. I say that obviously as somewhat of a joke, but there is another side to it as well. It is a bit of a cross to bear in some weird way. Anyway, just to finish on me before I go into a whole big spiel, I left the Defense Forces, after coming back from that overseas mission in Syria, and I was working as a barrister in Dublin for a couple of years, in kind of areas of civil law, just kind of getting some experience under my belt. I worked with a few very, very good barristers in Dublin. And most recently, I've been in Australia for a year, for somewhat personal reasons, but I enjoyed life down under. It was good to see a different part of the world that wasn't from the confines of an army camp, and I'm currently back in Ireland. So that's where that's kind of a whistle stop tour of my life so far. I guess you. Sorry, yeah. Fire ahead, Chris.
No, just interested in your story and kind of the way you framed it. That you think the turning point was because you experienced different cultures that had different problems and different challenges. Obviously, black market, different currencies. Like you kind of seen it. Did you have a kind of like an investing mindset before? I know you said you didn't have an economics and finance background. Did you see the problem of inflation before? Did you see it as a challenge? Were you kind of more, look, let's get into a job, work as hard as I can, build up a wealth like that? Was that in your mindset before, when you were here in Ireland, or did it all click before? Like people kind of have a journey of maybe a mindset before, but
it's a great question, actually, and the short answer is no. I didn't have an investing mindset. I think the first time I really started thinking about investments at all was the pandemic. I downloaded a trading app. I remember thinking about airline stocks and whether they'd suffer and that sort of stuff. So I went from being someone who relatively didn't think a huge amount about investments. And I remember actually arriving in Beirut, it was at the time, and I remember people were briefing me about what you needed to do with money, and you needed to be careful not to spend US dollars in restaurants, and you had to make sure that you paid in the local currency because you get a better rate. And I remember being quite bamboozled by all this at the time. It just didn't make a huge amount of sense to me. And now when I talk to people about currencies, I see that same look on their faces that I would have had back then. So for whatever reason, I suppose a lot of dominoes started to fall in that period, and fast forward 2 or 3 years, and it's one of my greatest interests is writing about the difference between saving and investing, and how that concept has become artificially blurred, and how much of a negative that is for society. So it's something I spend quite a lot of time thinking about in the last couple of years. But yeah, before that, not a huge amount at all. I wouldn't say I had a great understanding.
Yeah, and I think that's the same for quite a lot of people. Like you may dabble in some things or thought about maybe investing or savings or how to get ahead, how to beat inflation, but not deep, and not thinking about the challenges with money. And then, as you say, Bitcoin kind of opens your mind then to look at things completely different. So if that was kind of your touch point and your experience, you could probably imagine if you hadn't made the decisions you made and hadn't landed there, what would you be doing today? I know, you, and we'll touch on this as well, if you want to give a bit of background, first of all, on the Bitcoin Network Ireland, which you're heavily involved in.
Sure.
And then a follow-on question from that. So just explain what that is, and then explain what you think is the challenge in Ireland. We had an offline conversation about this a couple of days ago, where maybe you're seeing things, Rich, that I'm not seeing. My view has been for a long while that Ireland is far behind. I think you're seeing maybe a turning point in that. Do you think it's it's related to something that's happening in the country? Why are we sheltered from things in Ireland that we don't quite get that exposure? I know the euro can be seen as a strong currency, for example, and the economy can be seen as strong. What is it that differentiates some of the Bitcoiners who've had well, some people who've went to Bitcoin and some people who don't in Ireland? So very broad topic. But look, talk about Bitcoin Network Ireland, first of all, your involvement there, and then where you think Ireland is on the Bitcoin journey.
Yeah, so I guess it was a couple of years ago now at this point. I guess my sense was that there wasn't any serious effort to bring these discussions to a more mainstream audience in Ireland. You listen to podcasts and it's mostly American voices you hear, sometimes British. Obviously, What Bitcoin Did was a great British podcast that's been reinstituted recently. But Peter McCormick obviously did a huge amount with that podcast, and Danny Knowles now. But in terms of an Irish lens, there were very few people talking about this. Very few people seemed to have any serious comprehension of it. There was practically zero discussion in any serious circles. And when I say serious circles, I just mean, politics, banking, money, finance, those sort of spheres. The people who are generally influential in the country when it comes to finance, economics, either seemed to be completely oblivious or actively against it. So maybe we won't name any names on the podcast, but there's a couple of key names who I'm sure that I'm generally referring to, and I genuinely don't mean any disrespect. I think those of us who are pro Bitcoin probably need to realize that most people, Bitcoin does raise a kind of red flag and a kind of scam filter and a pyramid scheme, and obviously we believe that people after 15 or 16 years should have the humility and the open-mindedness to go back and reassess when they've been wrong for so long. But I don't think it makes them bad people that they've generally been dismissive, and that they haven't yet done that. So look, I try to be, to quote Michael Saylor, try to be cheerful and constructive in these things. In any event, I saw that there was a gap, and when I say I, myself and a couple of others saw that there was a gap in the market for just a little bit more of a serious discussion. You can achieve a lot, but you can't achieve everything by shit posting on Twitter. So a few of us came together. There was a couple of Irish groups on different social media channels, and I think I put the word out and said, "Is anybody else interested in getting involved in something?" And a few of us came together. A few really good guys, all guys for now, unfortunately, but a few of us came together, and we kind of had the same vision that we'd like to set up something, and kind of pull together, make it a more cohesive effort. So after a lot of kind of iterations of ideas and names, we ended up landing on Bitcoin Network Ireland. So the idea of Bitcoin Network Ireland is that it's a non-profit organization, importantly. So it doesn't have an axe to grind or a vested commercial interest or agenda. Obviously, those of us involved have an interest in seeing Bitcoin succeed, but that's secondary. It comes from a place of conviction, followed by obviously making an appropriate investment decision for yourself as an individual. I always say to people, you can take your advice from three different types of people. You can take it from an uninformed person, you can take it from an informed person that owns Bitcoin, or an informed person that doesn't own Bitcoin. So you kind of have to choose your poison. But anyway, so the group came together. We created, did a lot of work on branding, created a website. And now look, it's a small group of people. It's really only a few individuals who've given their time fully voluntary over the last kind of year and a half or so since it's been set up. We launched at the Bitcoin conference 2023 in Dublin. So we did a launch. We let people know what we're about. We published an open letter to describe what the aims and objectives of the group are. And those aims and objectives are very simple. It's to advocate for sensible policy, and to educate and inform people in Ireland about the benefits of Bitcoin adoption. So whether it's from a personal savings perspective, whether it's from a business growth and development, from these different lenses. So primarily so far we've published content, we have sent out newsletters, done things like that, and a lot of it has been about letting other Bitcoiners in Ireland know that, there is a kind of a group out there working on their behalf, and in some cases just reassuring people that they're not insane, because it can be quite a lonely place, especially at this phase of adoption. Most people who are Bitcoiners generally don't know a huge amount of other Bitcoiners in their personal life. They just know them as being Bitcoiners who they've met at Bitcoin meetups or Bitcoin events. So it can be a little bit of an isolating thing. So I guess the aim of the group is to advocate, educate. What we are working on at the moment, which hopefully we'll be able to share in the relative near future, is a couple of pretty serious documents for policymakers. So there's obviously been a huge amount of momentum in places like the US. The Overton window has shifted dramatically in the last few months. The idea of a strategic Bitcoin reserve would have been a complete fantasy a year ago, whereas now you've got a former and to be US president talking about a Bitcoin stockpile. These are events are moving pretty quickly. Now, whether that all materializes or whether it peters out to be revisited later is another question. But certainly things have changed. So we're trying to get ahead and to try and put something in front of policymakers to really give them no excuse but to take this seriously. Because as you said, Chris, you asked me what is the current state of Bitcoin adoption in Ireland, or what is the current state when it comes to policy circles, and it really is quite poor. There really is very little discussion about it. In most other European countries, there's some very vocal pro Bitcoin, whether it's a member of parliament or senator or there's kind of one in every. If you're in Canada, Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the opposition, who's probably going to be the next prime minister, is an ardent Bitcoiner. He's quoted the fiat standard in parliament. In the UK, you have the Right Honourable Steve Baker was an MP up until losing his seat recently enough, who had been pushing these ideas. He's now on the board of Axiom Bitcoin. So you have serious people in a lot of other countries that are making serious moves to make sure that countries don't get left behind, and it sort of seems like we don't really have that. So one of our aims is to try and bring those people on board. Right. No, sorry, fire ahead, Jim.
No, keep going.
I was going to say what is interesting is again the person who was spotted at the Bitcoin MENA conference in Abu Dhabi only a couple of days ago, which is a former highly important minister, in Fine Gael, Simon Coveney. And that picture did the rounds of him at the conference. So it goes to show that I think one thing that Ireland has is its size can sometimes be an advantage. Even if we are late starters and late bloomers to certain things, we can pivot relatively fast. And I'd be hopeful that, given our track record with tech and foreign direct investment, we seem to be relatively good at smelling an advantage when one comes around. You'd like to think that we could be quick enough to pivot on this. So I would say at the current state is that things are a little bit worrying that there isn't any serious discussion. But even I saw there on Twitter tonight that a guy who ran for election in Dublin, a guy called Nick Delahanty, he didn't actually get in, but he's made quite a presence online. He put up a tweet just this evening saying, "Is anybody in Ireland paying attention to the rhetoric coming out of the US?" That's incredibly important that people like him are saying things like that, because that's what we need for people, I guess, to start paying attention.
And do you think that it's going to come from Bitcoiners themselves being vocal, which I think is going to play a part, like what we're trying to do here at Emerge21 and what you guys are trying to do at BNI? But do you think it's going to take someone in a leadership position, whether it's in politics or business, to drive the country forward? Or do you think that there's going to be pain maybe in Ireland through inflation, and you've written about housing crisis and stuff like that, which we'll go into in a second, for people to start looking for that solution? Because my preference is not preference, but I think the best way that people find it is through a discovery themselves, rather than being told here's what Bitcoin is and you should look into it because of this reason. Like if somebody feels pain through it or has a realization like you had with your experience abroad, that's to me the best way to learn, because it's kind of directly impacting you. So yeah, I suppose the question is, do you think Ireland's going to come along once someone endorses it that's in a huge position within Ireland? or do you think that some of the challenges economically are going to bring Bitcoin adoption?
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess what you say makes a certain amount of sense in that, a democratically elected government should be reflecting the will of the people. So as a primary position, the government should be responsive to what people want. But there is a feedback loop there. So if a government and I say apparatus, but I mean, for example, its national broadcaster like RT have essentially been telling people that this is a scam or a Ponzi scheme or something to be ignored for years. That's not a good thing either. So I think there has to be some degree of leadership, but without pulling people beyond what they're ready for, if that makes sense. So I think, you could look at El Salvador as an example. Is it necessarily a good thing that a strong, popular president has YOLO'd some of the country's funds into Bitcoin? And you could argue that both ways. You could say that that's leadership, that's bold, that's decisive. In the case of the likes of Ireland, I think what we need is, and this is something we're going to be targeting in the upcoming piece that we're hoping to release in the new year, is we're going to be advocating for a permissive environment. That's the phraseology that we're going to use. So we're not going to be recommending that the government goes and uses the central bank to start buying uploads of Bitcoin on behalf of the citizens, but we're going to be advocating that citizens should be able to make their own free decisions, and ultimately the regulatory and tax environment should be such that they're allowed to do so in a free manner. And the information environment is also pretty important. So I would like to think that people will come to this before it becomes a point of pain. I think people have probably learned a lot about inflation and the cost of living, and indeed the role of central banks in that in the last couple of years. I do think people, through the information channels of the internet, have learned that central banks have played a role in inflation pressures over the last number of years. Central banks haven't unwound their balance sheets like they signaled that they intended to do so. There's the classic clip of the European Central Bank's Christine Lagarde. I think it was on a Dutch television show where she was asked whether the European Central Bank's balance sheet was a bubble, and she assured the host that it would come, it would be brought down, and it has to a very small degree, but not in its totality. So there's a huge amount of money out there that has been injected into the financial system that has made its way into people's pockets, that it has never been removed, because of course you can't really remove money that you've given out. It's not as simple as that, and that's one thing that I think we suffer from a small extent, is that sometimes Bitcoiners, we oversimplify the mechanics of how these things work. It's extremely complicated. But I do think we're directionally correct. When you undertake monetary policy operations like quantitative easing, it doesn't matter that there's a lot of technical jargon and complexity to what you're doing. Ultimately, you're printing digital money to increase the purchasing power of some and not all, and that's an incredibly unfair thing to do, and it's an entirely undemocratic thing to do in a society where, in reality, most people don't understand how that works. So sorry, slight tangent there, but yeah, I'd like to think it will all happen. I'd like to think that people, through education, can learn, and we can improve our lot through deliberate action, rather than kind of the whole, things are going to get so bad, like in Argentina's case, that we're all just so fed up that we're going to vote for somebody with a chainsaw saying he's going to slash the state. So that's my hope, and that's why I think realistically there's two types of Bitcoiners. I think there's the first type is there's absolutely no point engaging with politics. It's all rotten to the core, and we need to just burn it all down metaphorically, but ignore it and it will go away. And I subscribe to the second type, which is that outcomes will be better with constructive dialogue. People can learn. Most people are out to do a good job, and the incentive systems often don't let them do that. But Bitcoin is something that improves the incentive systems, and therefore, by engaging, we can make things better. So I try to be optimistic about these things, because I think it's probably the better way to live, and it keeps you more sane.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. I did read a few of your articles, not all of them, before. The one that I think you've probably I've seen you refer to a few times is, and this is probably not well, maybe it is nuanced for Ireland, but basically a housing crisis in Ireland, and how the fiat system has affected it, and how Bitcoin is a solution. Do you want to talk a bit about that, maybe the specifics in Ireland, but also, I see that as a global challenge for most people.
Yeah, it certainly is a global challenge. I mean, I think we mentioned earlier financial privilege, and in Ireland, you mentioned that the euro is one of the stronger currencies, and it certainly is. I mean, the euro is a reserve currency. We often talk about the dollar being a reserve currency, but I can't remember the exact figures off the top of my head. But if the dollar constitutes 40 something percent of international reserves, the euro is 20 odd percent or something to that degree. So a lot of people outside of Europe hold the euro as a reserve asset, which strengthens the euro. So we're quite lucky in that regard. And without that, our money would certainly be worse. And obviously, there's a price paid by others for that. So it's obviously not an ideal setup. But the euro works for payments. Most people go into a shop, they don't struggle to pay for things. If you're in any country in Europe, it's relatively easy. And to be honest, even if you're outside Europe in another westernized country, payments are pretty easy. We have seen some degree of debanking and political censorship, but that certainly hasn't reached any sort of noticeable level in Europe yet. As much as it's something that I think we need to be wary of. So I think when you're trying to explain to the likes of Irish people why Bitcoin is important, it's when you come at it from a purely money lens, you really have to focus on the preserving purchasing power element. And I think the best way to get this across in the situation that we're in is through the housing crisis. It really is the one issue that makes me feel like I'm living in the Matrix. We hear constant discussion on the airwaves, nonstop, about the fact that we don't have enough housing, and the fact that housing is unaffordable, the fact that housing has gone up against salaries for years now. And I'm yet to hear anybody outside of the kind of conversations that we would listen to in our circles speak about what I consider to be the logical root cause of that, which is a broken financial system. And in fact, I credit to Gript, actually picked up on that piece and published it. And the editor, John McGurk, actually said this was the most thought-provoking piece he's ever had sent into him. But outside of that, you just don't see the money discussed in any of the mainstream circles. So what is the issue? I guess the issue is that when the very system at the base layer of determining how things are valued is broken, you can have these kind of complex, nuanced, but extremely distortive effects higher up in the chain. So when it comes to housing, in my view, there's a couple of main reasons that the housing market's broken. So first, housing has become a massively financialized asset. So people can't save their money through fiat currencies. That's pretty much a given at this stage. It's a losing strategy. When people can't do that, they're forced to speculate on other things. They're forced to go out on the risk curve, or essentially just buy up things that other people will need in the future, because those things are harder to produce than the currency, than the money. In Ireland, the poison of choice is property. It's almost in our DNA that the only way to build financial wealth is to buy properties. That often can be, as someone actually told me a story today about one of the Healy Rays who was asked, something along the lines of, I could be misquoting it now, but you've got 50 odd properties. Does that not seem like an awful lot? Does that seem very unfair? And he replied, I'm housing the people of Ireland. So on one view, you can say, well, what harm if people are buying properties? People still live in the properties. But when you financialize an asset like a property, you create an awful lot of distortive effects. So property becomes very tied to prevailing credit conditions. So if we rewind to the Celtic Tiger, what you saw as interest rates were brought down and down and down, property prices went up and up and up. So everybody started to speculate on property. It was in the bank's interest to lend money to people even who didn't need property. People were borrowing 0% mortgages. The builders were getting huge amounts of money to build housing estates. So there was no element of being judicious about where the housing estates were, that the property was really needed, that the whole system wasn't essentially tethered to reality, because it was all on the back of artificial credit, which was being distorted by artificially low interest rates. That led to a huge to some degree that actually led to overbuilding. It led to wasteful building. It led to building of housing estates that nobody wanted in places that nobody needed them. And when the music stopped, because the music always has to stop, the cost is always revealed. The issue with fiat generally is that, you know, misallocation of capital can continue for longer than it would have otherwise. So when the music stopped, all of a sudden you have a calamitous crash in property prices. So therefore, you have an oversupply in the market. Prices, you know, prices crash, and then as a population in the years that follow continues to rise, you don't have the capacity to build up because all the builders have gone bust. Nobody's building anymore. It's just not, it's not viable. And an industry like that can't just scale up and down overnight. That's kind of the first reason. And sorry, that was a little bit long-winded. The second, so the first reason is that it's completely tied. It's a completely financialized asset, and it's tied to prevailing credit conditions, which are artificially volatile, with the boom and bust cycles that are inherent in a fiat currency system. Secondly is the incentives, and the incentives is a much simpler one to explain. You'll be glad to know, because there is some complexity to these things. They're not just something you can rattle off in 2 sentences, but the incentives are pretty clear, and I think the incentives were best encapsulated in a great photo I saw of one of Biden's campaign speeches before the election. And in his speech, he said, "My father said to me that the only way for an American to build wealth is through investing in property and to own their own home." You know, so he was talking, and he basically bragged that under him, house prices have gone up. The sign in front of his podium said, "Make housing affordable." You know, so he's appealing to 2 different demographics within the same society. He's appealing to the homeowners, and he's appealing to those who are trying to buy homes and can't. And you know, that's something that we deal with all the time now. So there's 2 types of people in Irish society. There's those who own their home, and there's those who don't. And the incentives between those 2 groups are completely perverse and opposing. If you want to make housing affordable, that literally means you want the thing that most people in Ireland use to build wealth and to retire. You want it to go down in value. You know, you can phrase it however you want, but that's what you're saying. And so those things aren't compatible. So you have politicians always trying to strike a balance between opening the floodgates, building more houses, making houses more affordable, but also, and not just hitting the value of the investments of the property owning class and you know, people who are near retirement, but actually potentially jeopardizing the collateral of the banking system, which is even more existential. So, you know, the money has created this incredibly perverse incentive to restrict building. And it may not be easy to say, well, look, you know, show me where the government have purposely stopped building, but it seeps out. These incentives seep out in things like planning permission and in zoning. You know, if you think that local councils are going to zone land or on Port Planala are going to, you know, allocate more than they need, just so we can fix the housing crisis, I think that's naive, and I think there's a lot of doublespeak going on, and I think people aren't. Nobody wants it in their backyard, because, you know, prices of houses aren't just a homogenous blob in Ireland, they're also localized. I think ultimately, you know, trying to fix these things from the top down through, you know, supply is obviously what's needed. I mean, nobody would disagree with that, but it's a kind of sustainable supply where you take out these conflicting incentives. And I really do believe that the only way to remove these conflicting incentives are to give people a better option for storing wealth. If people have a better option for saving their value, for banking on their retirement, that a lot of these conflicting incentives just dissolve. They don't become a big entrenched political battle. So it's like, you know, build a bridge and they'll come. Give people a better alternative, and they will use that alternative as opposed to real estate. And I mean, I'm very hopeful for this housing issue because of Bitcoin. Without it, I wouldn't be as hopeful. But even without it, I mean, we will get to a point of population decline in Ireland at some point. And I think at that point, it'll be pretty obvious that, you know, housing is a depreciating asset. It requires maintenance and upkeep. It is taxed. It's subject to all sorts of jurisdictional risk, local weather risk, and all of these different things. And I think people should view housing more like they view their car, which is a depreciating asset which they need and which they need to put money into. So I think, it all comes down to that Jeff Booth quote, which I'm sure every Bitcoiner has heard, that, when the money is abundant, everything else is scarce. And when the money is scarce, everything else is abundant. Because the money is abundant, people are essentially, through hook or by crook, whatever the phrase is, they're essentially hoarding things that other people need. And that's a terribly divisive way for a society to structure itself. And unfortunately, for whatever reason, these ideas, and I probably haven't articulated it overly clearly there, but these ideas seem to be just a little bit too abstract to be popular. The great thing about Bitcoin is that we don't need everybody to start understanding this to incentivize. It's all driven by incentives. People will start to realize that Bitcoin is a better investment. And the system, incredibly, there's very few problems for this. There's very few problems that have solutions as simple, but it really is like this big complicated knot that all you have to do is pull it. All you have to do is pull the rope and the knots actually unravel themselves. All we have to do is fix the money. And I do believe that a lot of these upstream issues will resolve themselves. And housing is just the most obvious example.
Yeah, and to be honest, I think you've articulated that very well. You broke down the problem very well, and I know your conclusion is that Bitcoin is a solution to this. How do you think this plays out, say, over the next 5 years? Then I think you can see it already playing out. So we talked on the last episode about how small businesses are going to adopt Bitcoin. So, and this is from Safedean's book, but money starts off as kind of a collectible. Then it goes to store of value, which we're very much in the store of value stage at the moment. And I think that's clear. The store of value goes on to medium of exchange, then unit of account. But that unit of account phase is not talked about, and it's seen as the ladder out of the stages. But it is kind of happening when you look at house prices compared to Bitcoin, or in Bitcoin, so priced in Bitcoin. Do you think that will still continue over years? Is there any reason for it not to? You mentioned already, population decline and maybe supply and housing, but do you see any reason why that wouldn't continue? And what's your kind of general 5-year outlook for Bitcoin, say globally? And then you can touch on Ireland if you want specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point about store value coming before medium exchange and unit of account is a very interesting one, because it's an extremely logical point, and it's one that I'm trying to focus upon in this paper that I was speaking about. People have to generally want to hold something before they're going to trade in it, especially when the incumbent system, which is the euro, works pretty well as a medium exchange and a unit of account. People often love to condense the world to kind of macro charts, and they think macro charts represent reality. When I speak to people in my circle, I have seen a mindset shift. I have seen a lot of people who, don't even own Bitcoin, but when you start showing them house prices denominated in Bitcoin, they do get it. This realization is dawning. So I suppose my 5-year outlook is a pretty tough one to give, because it's at that timeline where anything could really happen, and there's obviously unknown unknowns, and there's always risks. So I don't know what adoption looks like, but I do think that we're poised for an interesting part of the adoption curve in its totality, because there's a lot of factors that combined provide a lot of tailwinds to Bitcoin. So obviously we're in a stage where institutional investors have now pretty much accepted that this is an investable asset, and that's a big mindset shift. And follow the money, as they say. So when you look at where the money is going, the narratives and the regulations are bound to follow. So when you look at these Bitcoin ETFs in the US, I mean, the capital that they're accumulating is just huge. If you look at Larry Fink's comments, that what he has said recently, if you think that isn't going to trickle down to your local investment advisors in the investment funds in Ireland, I think I think it will. I think we see a lot of interesting regulatory changes. I think the US administration is going to be an interesting one. I think we're still at a stage where a lot of people in Europe, Ireland especially, when it comes to the Trump administration, a lot of what's happening, if the Democrats had said it, would be world changing. But because it's under a Republican and specifically a Trump administration, it's just seen as a Trump phenomenon. And that's quite frustrating, because, I think those of us know that those of us here probably agree that Bitcoin is and should be nonpartisan. It's not tied to a political ideology. And I think a great example of that is that there's two good books written. One is a conservative's case for Bitcoin, and the other is a progressive case for Bitcoin. So everybody can claim Bitcoin serves their ideology, and nobody can claim it at the same time. I think that's a bit of a shame that the entire narrative around this is kind of the Trump pump. I don't particularly like that, but it is what it is. I mean, if we can't do anything about it if certain people can't see past that. But I think his administration will change the Overton window. I mean, if you look at, he has appointed Howard Lutnick as his Commerce Secretary. So one of the most important economics-related posts in the world's superpower is a vocal Bitcoin proponent. Has said that he has hundreds of millions worth of Bitcoin, soon to be billions. He is the CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, which is doing, Bitcoin collateralized loans. They hold the U.S. Treasuries on behalf of Tether. So these are fascinating changes that I think there could be a bit of a whiplash effect to how quick things move. How that equates to price and cycles and all that sort of stuff, I don't know, but I do expect a significant. I do expect that this cycle will be quite significant. I think the last cycle was where institutions, public companies, states kind of dip their toes. I'd be very surprised if in this couple of years we don't see more countries with kind of not just kind of beating around the bush or kind of dipping their toes in through a kind of semi-state body mining type. That sort of like, it's kind of news, but it's kind of not. It's like Germany owns a 20% stake of the telecoms company, which is now going to mine Bitcoin. It's a very kind of tangential. I think we're going to see nation states go in this cycle, and I think that's just going to blow the Overton window wide open. And I don't think we're going to be able to avoid the conversation in Ireland for much longer. I think questions will be asked, and so look, I don't know where it all goes. I'm not going to give any firm predictions. I've no idea. I'm always torn between ideas of we're in a new phase where there aren't the same pronounced cycles. You have all of this institutional money. I think the MicroStrategy phenomenon is fascinating. I think what Michael Saylor has done there is essentially, open the glitch in cyberspace between fiat and the world's hardest asset, Bitcoin. And it's very hard to intellectually figure out how that ends, because it's like this flywheel that only speeds up. And I think the fact that it seems to be like that just worries me in a weird way that I can't explain, because it's actually an analogy that Michael Saylor himself gave. It's that if a plane goes too fast, its wings break. It's that's what worries me, is almost like the political risk inherent in this, because success is great, but too much success can be dangerous. So in terms of the big picture, and just to tie it back to housing, I think we're some time away from the normal store of value for your average Irish person being Bitcoin. But I do think that is going to change in a quicker timeline than many predict. And I've been a bit vague there. I'm saying it's not too quick, but it's not that slow. I don't think it's in the next 2 to 3 years, but I think a little bit further than that, maybe in the next 5 to 7 years, I think we see significant changes in how the average person deals with storing value into their retirement. I think we're probably it's probably a little bit beyond that again before it starts fixing these issues, if that makes sense. I think that takes some time, but I'm quite optimistic that it's on the horizon.
Yeah, you did say you were optimistic about it, but it's hard not to. I think there's clear signals there. I think there's clear trajectory. I think you rolled out there. There's many positives towards Bitcoin at the moment. To me, it's almost obvious the direction it's going. Now, again, how that correlates the price is something different. And Emerge21, we wouldn't do price predictions or anything like that, but the general trajectory for adoption is up. We kind of say that once you learn Bitcoin, you don't unlearn it, and that adoption is growing daily.
It's very rare to find somebody who was in and that isn't anymore. Perhaps Nassim Taleb is probably the only example who wrote the introduction to the Bitcoin standard and then is now its greatest critic. And one thing I was going to say that I think will certainly mark this cycle is that up until now, us kind of Bitcoiners have been the crazy guys in the corner, and I think we're going to remain the crazy guys in the corner a little bit longer than we expect. And when I say that, I think what we're going to get over the next couple of years is that, we know it's a good store of value. It's an investment class, and it has a place in our portfolio. I think that's going to be the kind of, your job is done here. You told us all it was a good investment. We should have listened to you, but we have it now. We've got it covered. We have our 5% or 10%. It's something we can invest in. We hold it. It's volatile, but we get it now. And I think probably the next few years will be, people like us saying, no, you still don't get it. This is global money. This is the world's. It doesn't even make sense to call it the world's reserve currency, because it's just money. You don't need a reserve currency when you just have good money that's accessible to everybody. It kind of breaks all our paradigms. So I think the kind of phase and the type of explanations that we need to give are going to change, and it's going to lead to different but also very interesting conversations.
Yeah, I agree. Like, I'm of the mind that there's no other outcome at the end until except for a full Bitcoin standard, and that's the way it goes. I know people say fiat's going to exist, dollar's going to exist, but play that out long enough, and it's not possible, actually. Alan, any questions from you for Rich?
No, basically, just I'm sitting back, taking it all in. It's a great conversation, great discussion, and everything's very well articulated in many respects. And I'm actually learning quite a lot as well, just from what you're saying, Rich, around everything, especially the housing crisis in Ireland and the issues around that. And the same reflects like all over Ireland, north of Ireland, south. It's the same concept. And it's an interesting thing, just what you're doing, what you're working on now, and kind of bringing something into the political realm as well, and trying to actually get people to really take note of this. I suppose from my point of view, it is people just it comes across the board. People just don't take the time to really understand Bitcoin and get under the hood of Bitcoin. Is that kind of effectively what you're trying to do with this, with what you're working on, this paper you're working on at the moment?
Yeah, it's to try and give the right people in the right places no excuse.
Yeah.
A lot of policy groups like ours, and some are much bigger. We've great relations with the group in the UK, Bitcoin Policy UK. Freddie New over there does great work. I think he was in Africa there yesterday giving a talk with Jack Dorsey. He's a fantastic advocate. But a lot of groups will fundraise to give a copy of the Bitcoin standard to everybody in Parliament. And I think there's a sense of if you give a politician a book,
Yeah.
or any sort of bureaucratic book, it's something written by an American, or we could probably give them Chris's book, would be a bit closer to home, but it's easier for them to kind of ignore. Whereas if we write the book for them, it's just a little bit harder to ignore. So that's kind of the idea with this, to give them no excuse. Now look, we're not naive. We know that these initiatives initially will probably be ignored, but we also know that there will be catalysts for increased attention down the line. And if you give somebody something that they didn't pay attention to, there will be ample opportunities to remind them that you gave to them, if that makes sense. So that's kind of the longer term thought.
Yeah. No, I think it's a great initiative, a great thing to do, and it's essential getting that in front of, especially in the political realm. As I say, it's something that myself and Chris we've kind of not really thought around too much, but when you actually break it down, that they are the people making the decisions around the country, around the economics, around the different policies, housing, etc. So it stands to sense that needs to be done. And
Just one very quick point on that. I think one of the guys in one of the groups we're in, when he saw the picture of Simon Coveney, he said, "Oh, that'll convince my ma," or something to that.
Yeah.
And it's something I've said before, is that there's a certain generation of people that, it's not even a generational thing, but it's a mindset. And I certainly don't blame people for this. But some people will need to hear Pat Kenny say, "Oh yeah, this is interesting. I think it's probably not a pyramid scheme." That's just the way the world works. So I think it's important in that respect, because I want to kind of maybe just say one more thing, if that's okay. And I know we're probably touching the time there of an hour, but none of this is a joke. I think it's easy to get carried away in the Bitcoin community and on Twitter. And people love saying have fun staying poor, and but this is people's lives, and in the long term, I think Bitcoin winning, or becoming money, is the most important thing for humanity, as dramatic as that sounds. I think having a fair, neutral, decentralized money base where there is little to no Cantillon effect is the most important thing. I think that it's an underrated cause of inequality. I find it fascinating, and again, one of those matrix moments that, you know, people in the mainstream and economists, even the likes of Thomas Piketty, you know, they don't talk about how fiat money, by its very creation, is the most obvious stone under which to look for inequality. You know, it's just ignored. While that's true in the long term, in the short to medium term, for every winner, there's a loser. So every time you see your Bitcoin price go up, somebody is holding a fiat currency that, you know, lost power, that started powering down. And that's, you know, it's fine at the margin, but, you know, there are people who were planning to retire at a certain point who won't be able to retire at that point, or who will and then won't have enough funds. You know, so this is, and I just kind of want to wrap up with this is a deadly serious topic, and I think it's always important to remember that. I don't always remember it, you know, so I'm not trying to sit here to preach, but it's something that's worth bearing in mind, that this is, you know, it's, in some senses, it's the most serious of topics. So I do take it quite seriously.
Yeah, totally agree. As I've said many a time, for anybody, especially in the business scene as well, it's the most important thing to understand right now. Based on, again, the previous discussion myself and Chris had, it is small businesses are struggling. Those are individuals, those are families, those are people that, you know, need to be, you know, putting their store of value into something that's going to store that value and grow the value. So it's essential to understand this. And as you say, it is a deadly serious topic. Yet at times we do kind of bluff around a little bit around it, but that's pretty much, I think, good. Like that was a great discussion. I say, Chris, do you have any other points to bring in, or do you want to wrap
No,
things up?
no, I find it interesting. As I say, I would encourage anyone listening to follow Rich and read all his articles. I think they're fascinating. Yeah, and follow obviously the Bitcoin Ireland initiative as well. So yeah, or Bitcoin Network Ireland. So yeah, it's no, thanks Rich for coming on. Great to have our first guest on.
Yeah, I really am honored, and yeah, I wish you two guys the best of luck. I'm really a big fan of what you're doing. I think the brand looks great, and I think there aren't two better men in Ireland to do it. So good luck with everything going forward. And I don't know, maybe I can be your 100th guest, or we can do a recap.
Yeah, we'll definitely have you on again for sure. Rich, it's been interesting talking to you, and yeah, we'll speak again soon.
Super. Okay, thanks guys.
Cheers, and thank you. Take care.
Bye bye.